In the scorching summer of 1683, an enormous Ottoman army, estimated between 140,000 to 170,000 soldiers, according to various contemporary sources, stood menacingly at the gates of Vienna. This massive force represented the largest Ottoman military expedition ever launched into European territory, comprising not only the elite Janissary Corps and Sipahi cavalry, but also contingents from vassal states across the Balkans, Crimean Tatars, and auxiliary forces from across the empire's vast dominions. For Vienna's defenders, outnumbered by more than 10 to 1 and feeling desperately abandoned by their allies, hope seemed nothing more than a distant memory. The city's population had swelled to approximately 60,000 souls, including refugees who had fled the advancing Ottoman forces, all now trapped within walls that seemed increasingly fragile against such overwhelming odds. For 2 agonizing months, from July to September 1683, Vienna would endure systematic starvation, relentless bombardment, and the terrifying reality of sappers burrowing beneath their very foundations. The city was brought to the absolute brink of annihilation, its defenders reduced to fewer than 5,000 able-bodied fighters by early September, while disease, hunger, and exhaustion claimed lives daily. Yet a combination of fatal miscalculations by the Ottoman commander, the extraordinary resilience of Vienna's defenders, and a desperate last-ditch coalition would orchestrate one of history's most stunning reversals. This is the epic story of how a city balanced on the precipice of doom was saved by one of the largest and most decisive cavalry charges ever recorded in military history. To comprehend how 2 of the world's greatest empires collided at Vienna's ancient walls, we must understand the complex geopolitical landscape of the late 17th century. This was truly an age of giants, where massive powers competed for dominance across continents. In Western Europe, France under King Louis XIV, the Sun King, had emerged as the continent's dominant cultural and military force. Louis's court at Versailles set the standard for European nobility, while his armies had proven their superiority in multiple conflicts. The French king's ambitions knew few bounds, and he actively sought to expand his influence eastward, viewing the Habsburg domains as his primary obstacle to continental hegemony. In the east, the Ottoman Empire remained a colossal force that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, and Balkans for centuries. This sprawling domain stretched from the gates of Vienna in the north to the deserts of Yemen in the south, from the shores of Algeria in the west to the borders of Persia in the east. At its height, the empire encompassed over 2 million square kilometers and ruled approximately 25 million subjects of diverse ethnicities and religions. However, by 1683, this was an empire wrestling with its own legacy and internal contradictions. The glorious days of expansion under Suleiman, the Magnificent, 1520 to 1566, were more than a century in the past. The empire had reached what historians now recognize as its natural geographic limits, with supply lines stretched to breaking point and administrative challenges mounting with each conquered territory. Internal strife had become endemic, with the Janissary Corps frequently revolting against sultans, provincial governors asserting increasing independence, and the complex devshirme system that had once provided capable administrators beginning to break down. The empire's military technology, once superior to European forces, was falling behind as European powers embraced new gunpowder technologies and tactical innovations. Despite these challenges, at the court of Sultan Mehmed IV in Constantinople, there burned a fierce desire to reclaim the empire's former glory and prove that Ottoman power remained undiminished. This hunger for renewed conquest found its perfect embodiment in one extraordinarily ambitious and ruthless man. Grand Vizier Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha was the driving force behind the 1683 campaign, a man whose personal ambitions would ultimately determine the fate of 2 empires. Born around 1634, Kara Mustafa wasn't born to power, but was adopted into the influential Köprülü family, one of the most successful political dynasties in Ottoman history. The Köprülü family had produced several grand viziers who had stabilized the empire during the mid-17th century crisis. Kara Mustafa rose through the imperial hierarchy with a combination of administrative skill, military competence, and ruthless political maneuvering. He had served as governor of Silesia, and later Damascus, where he gained valuable experience in both civil administration and military command. His marriage to the adopted daughter of Grand Vizier Köprülü Mehmed Pasha further cemented his position within the Ottoman elite. By 1676, when he was appointed Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa had developed an obsessive ambition that would prove both his driving force and ultimate downfall. He saw himself as destined to succeed where even the legendary Suleiman the Magnificent had failed in 1529, the conquest of Vienna and the opening of Central Europe to Ottoman rule. Contemporary accounts describe Kara Mustafa as an arrogant man of considerable intelligence but fatally flawed judgment. He was utterly confident in his military abilities and possessed an intense hatred for his Christian adversaries that bordered on the pathological. Ottoman chroniclers noted his tendency to underestimate his enemies while overestimating his own capabilities, a combination that would prove disastrous. For Kara Mustafa, the Vienna campaign represented far more than mere territorial expansion. It was to be his great jihad, a holy war that would outshine the legendary conquests of the past and secure his position as one of history's greatest Ottoman commanders. He envisioned himself returning to Constantinople in triumph, having opened the road to the heart of Europe, and perhaps even Rome itself. Kara Mustafa's primary adversary was Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, ruler of the vast but often fragmented Habsburg domains. In many ways, Leopold represented everything Kara Mustafa was not. Where the Ottoman commander was a warrior obsessed with military glory, Leopold was a deeply religious, scholarly ruler who found greater comfort in the music halls of his court than on battlefields. Born in 1640, Leopold had never been intended for the throne, originally destined for the church before the early death of his elder brother Ferdinand made him heir. This background perhaps explained his cautious, often indecisive nature when faced with military crises. He was famously unattractive, bearing the pronounced Habsburg jaw that marked generations of dynastic inbreeding, and suffered from various health problems throughout his life. Yet beneath Leopold's unprepossessing exterior lay a profound sense of duty to his empire and his Catholic faith. He saw himself as the defender of Christendom against both Ottoman expansion and Protestant heresy. His empire, however, was uniquely vulnerable to the challenges of the 1682. The Habsburg domains stretched from the Low Countries in the west to the borders of Ottoman Hungary in the east, encompassing modern-day Austria, Czech Republic, Hungary, parts of Poland, Belgium, and territories in Italy. This vast realm was populated by Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Italians, and numerous other ethnic groups, each with their own languages, traditions, and often conflicting loyalties. To the west, France's Louis XIV posed a constant and immediate threat. The Sun King actively worked to undermine Habsburg power through both direct military action and diplomatic intrigue. French agents operated throughout the German states, offering subsidies to any prince willing to oppose Habsburg interests. Most troubling for Leopold, France had begun providing quiet encouragement to the Ottomans, viewing their eastern advance as a convenient way to weaken their Habsburg rivals. This French-Ottoman understanding, while never formalized into a full alliance, represented one of the most cynical diplomatic arrangements of the era. Christian France was effectively cooperating with the Islamic Ottoman Empire against fellow Christians, prioritizing national interests over religious solidarity. The immediate catalyst for the 1683 campaign emerged from within Leopold's own territories. In Royal Hungary, the portion of historic Hungary that remained under Habsburg control, Protestant nobleman Imre Tököly was leading a widespread rebellion against Habsburg rule. Tököly, supported by a significant portion of the Hungarian nobility, had grievances that ran deep. The Habsburgs had imposed heavy taxes to fund their wars against France, imposed Catholicism on predominantly Protestant regions, and stationed German and Croatian troops throughout Hungary who were seen as occupying forces. Tököly's rebels, known as the Kuruk, had achieved significant military successes by 1682, controlling much of northern and eastern Royal Hungary. Facing defeat, Tököly and his confederates made the fateful decision to appeal to the Ottomans for support. This provided Kara Mustafa with exactly the pretext he needed. He convinced Sultan Mehmed IV that supporting the Hungarian rebels represented the perfect opportunity for a major campaign that would simultaneously weaken the Habsburgs and expand Ottoman territory. The Sultan's initial orders were actually quite modest, reflecting the more cautious approach that had characterized Ottoman policy in recent decades. Mehmed IV instructed his Grand Vizier to operate in western Hungary, capture a few strategic fortresses, and provide support to Thurkoli's rebellion. The campaign was intended as a limited intervention, not a full-scale invasion. However, Kara Mustafa had far grander and more dangerous designs. From the beginning, Vienna was his real target, and he systematically misled his sultan about the true scope of his ambitions. This deception would ultimately contribute to his downfall, as the sultan had not authorized the massive expenditure of resources that a siege of Vienna would require. On the 31st of March, 1683, a formal declaration of war arrived at Leopold's court in Vienna, delivered with all the ceremony that Ottoman diplomacy demanded. The document, written in ornate Ottoman Turkish, accused the Habsburgs of violating previous treaty agreements and supporting enemies of the Sultan. The very next day, the 1st of April, the vast Ottoman army began its historic march from Adrianople, modern Edirne, toward the Hungarian frontier. The scale of this military expedition was truly staggering, representing perhaps the largest single military force assembled in 17th-century Europe. The core Ottoman army numbered approximately 150,000 men, including 12,000 elite Janissaries, 50,000 provincial cavalry, Sipahis, 8,000 artillery specialists with over 300 cannons, and tens of thousands of support troops, including engineers, sappers, and logistical personnel. Leading the advance was a terrifying vanguard of 40,000 Crimean Tatars under Khan Selim Giray, whose role was to spread terror throughout the Austrian countryside. The Tatars were masters of rapid warfare, capable of covering enormous distances on their hardy steppe ponies. Their strategy was brutally simple: burn villages, capture slaves, and create such widespread panic that organized resistance would collapse before the main army arrived. Contemporary accounts describe the Ottoman army as resembling a moving city, with its vast baggage trains, mobile markets, field hospitals, and even traveling mosques. The Grand Vizier's personal retinue alone required over 1,000 camels and countless wagons to transport his headquarters, treasury, and the luxurious amenities befitting his exalted rank. News of this approaching juggernaut sent waves of panic throughout Austria and the German states. Refugees began fleeing westward in unprecedented numbers, carrying tales of Ottoman atrocities that grew more terrifying with each retelling. Churches across the Habsburg domains held special prayers for deliverance, while Leopold's diplomats worked frantically to assemble some form of international response. Leopold's strategic position was truly desperate. His own standing army numbered barely 30,000 men, and these were scattered across his vast territories. His traditional German allies were distant and slow to mobilize, hampered by the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire, where each prince had to be separately convinced to contribute troops. Leopold's greatest hope lay with Poland-Lithuania, Europe's largest state by territory and possessor of one of the continent's finest cavalry forces. After tense negotiations conducted through early 1683, the two powers signed the Treaty of Warsaw on the 31st of March, the same day the Ottoman declaration of war arrived in Vienna. This treaty created a defensive alliance with clearly defined mutual obligations. If the Ottomans attacked the key Polish fortress of Kraków, Leopold would provide 60,000 men for its defense. If they attacked Vienna, King Jan III Sobieski of Poland would march to Austrian aid with 40,000 troops. It was an alliance born of mutual desperation, as both rulers recognized that they faced destruction if they stood alone. The treaty also had crucial papal backing. Pope Innocent XI, deeply committed to the defense of Catholic Europe against Ottoman expansion, provided substantial financial subsidies to both powers and used his diplomatic influence to encourage other Catholic states to join the coalition. The Pope saw the Ottoman advance as an existential threat to Christianity itself. However, as the massive Ottoman host drew steadily closer throughout the late spring and early summer of 1683, a terrifying question hung over all of Catholic Europe. Would this hastily assembled alliance hold together when faced with the full fury of Ottoman military power? As summer 1683 began, the Ottoman war machine advanced with terrifying speed and efficiency. Kara Mustafa, consumed by his obsession with Vienna, made the strategically questionable decision to bypass many smaller fortresses that could have significantly slowed his advance. Fortresses like Győr, Komárom, and Esztergom, which commanded crucial river crossings and supply routes, were left unreduced in his rear. This decision reflected both Kara Mustafa's overconfidence and his poor understanding of European siege warfare. In Ottoman tradition, many fortresses surrendered when faced with overwhelming force, but European defensive doctrine emphasized prolonged resistance to buy time for relief armies. By leaving these strongholds intact, Kara Mustafa created potential threats to his own supply lines. Meanwhile, the Tatar horde fanned out across the Austrian countryside like a plague of locusts. Their tactics were refined through centuries of steppe warfare. Strike fast, capture everything of value, destroy what couldn't be carried, and disappear before organized resistance could form. Villages were systematically torched, livestock slaughtered or driven away, and inhabitants faced a terrible choice: flee immediately or face death or enslavement. The wave of terror reached Vienna itself by early July. Refugees streaming into the city brought horrifying accounts of Ottoman atrocities. Entire communities had been wiped out, churches desecrated, and thousands of Christians captured for the slave markets of Constantinople. The psychological impact was devastating. Many Viennese believed they were witnessing the end of Christian Europe. On the 7th of July, 1683, with Ottoman scouts already visible from the city walls, Emperor Leopold I made the agonizing decision to flee Vienna. This departure, conducted under cover of darkness with only a small retinue, was both strategically necessary and psychologically devastating. For the Viennese population, it appeared to confirm their worst fears. Even their emperor had abandoned them to their fate. Leopold's retreat to Passau, 300 kilometers up the Danube, was motivated by harsh, strategic realities. The emperor's capture would mean immediate surrender and the collapse of all resistance. From Passau, Leopold could work to coordinate the promised relief army while remaining beyond Ottoman reach. Nevertheless, his departure left Vienna's defenders feeling utterly abandoned. Command of Vienna's defense fell to one of the Habsburg monarchy's most capable soldiers, Field Marshal Ernst Rüdiger Graf von Starhemberg. Born in 1638 to an Austrian noble family with a long tradition of military service, Starhemberg had spent his adult life fighting the empire's enemies across multiple fronts. He had distinguished himself in campaigns against the French, Hungarians, and Ottomans, earning a reputation for both tactical skill and unshakable courage under fire. Appointed military governor of Vienna on the 7th of June, 1683, Starhemberg faced a task that seemed impossible. He commanded a garrison of approximately 15,000 men, a mixture of regular imperial troops, local militias, and hastily armed civilians. These forces had to defend a city against an army more than 10 times their number, while maintaining the morale of 60,000 terrified civilians. Vienna's fortifications, while impressive, reflected older concepts of siege warfare. The city was surrounded by a massive star fort system with 11 major bastions connected by thick walls, but these defenses had been designed primarily to resist traditional siege tactics involving scaling ladders and battering rams. Against the sophisticated mining techniques that the Ottomans had perfected, even the strongest walls could be undermined and destroyed. Starhemberg's greatest assets were his own iron determination and the desperate courage of the Viennese people. He understood that surrender meant not just military defeat, but the likely massacre of the civilian population. Ottoman armies rarely showed mercy to cities that forced them to conduct lengthy sieges. On the 14th of July, 1683, the Ottoman Siege of Vienna officially began as Kara Mustafa's vast army completely encircled the city. Contemporary accounts describe a sea of colorful tents stretching to the horizon, with the elaborate pavilions of Ottoman commanders rising like palaces above the common soldiers' quarters. The Grand Vizier's own headquarters occupied a space larger than many European towns. Following established Ottoman protocol, Kara Mustafa sent a messenger to demand Vienna's surrender. The terms, delivered with typical Ottoman formality, offered the garrison and civilians safe passage if they opened the gates immediately. However, everyone present understood that Ottoman mercy was notoriously unreliable, particularly after expensive and difficult campaigns. Starhemberg's response was characteristically blunt and defiant. "Let him come. I'll fight to the last drop of blood." This declaration, quickly spread throughout the city, became a rallying cry for the desperate defenders. Starhemberg knew exactly what surrender would mean. He had heard detailed reports of the massacre at nearby Perchtoldsdorf, where citizens who surrendered were slaughtered anyway in a frenzy of Ottoman bloodlust. It was at this crucial moment that Kara Mustafa made his first critical error. Supremely confident that terror alone would force a quick surrender, and eager to preserve Vienna's wealth for his own enrichment, he decided against launching an immediate all-out assault. Such an attack, while costly, might have succeeded, given the enormous disparity in numbers and the defenders' shocked morale. Even more fatally, in his haste to reach Vienna quickly, Kara Mustafa had left most of his heavy siege artillery behind in Hungary. His field guns, while numerous, lacked the power to breach Vienna's massive stone bastions. Unable to blast his way through the walls, he was forced to resort to the more time-consuming strategy of undermining them through mining operations. Unable to batter down Vienna's walls with artillery, the Ottomans began one of the most sophisticated siege operations in military history. They were acknowledged masters of siegecraft, with engineering techniques refined through centuries of conquest. The Ottoman approach to Vienna involved digging an extensive network of zigzagging approach trenches that allowed their forces to advance toward the walls while remaining protected from defensive fire. From these main trenches, teams of specialized sappers began the dangerous work of excavating mines, long tunnels aimed directly at the foundations of Vienna's bastions. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Pack these tunnels with enormous quantities of gunpowder, detonate them simultaneously, and create breaches wide enough for assault columns to storm through. For the next 2 months, the siege became a deadly subterranean battle of wits and engineering skill. The defenders, led by their own capable military engineers, responded by digging countermines designed to intercept Ottoman tunnels before they could reach their targets. When opposing tunnels met underground, the result was desperate hand-to-hand combat fought with pistols, swords, and shovels in complete darkness. Life within besieged Vienna became an agony of constant listening and vigilance. Citizens developed ingenious methods for detecting enemy digging operations, placing drums with dried peas on cellar floors. The vibrations from Ottoman mining would make the peas dance, revealing the enemy's location and direction. This intelligence allowed the Viennese to dig targeted countermines to intercept specific Ottoman operations. Above ground, daily life descended into a living hell that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. The city was completely cut off from all outside supply, and food disappeared with terrifying speed. Within weeks, the population was reduced to eating cats, dogs, rats, and even leather goods, boiled to extract any possible nutrition. Starvation was compounded by epidemic disease as dysentery and typhus swept through the overcrowded city. These diseases killed more people than Ottoman cannons and created a sanitation crisis that made conditions even more unbearable. Bodies had to be buried hastily in mass graves, and the constant threat of plague hung over the surviving population. Fatigue among the defenders reached such extreme levels that Starhemberg issued a standing order that any soldier found asleep while on watch was to be shot immediately. This harsh discipline, while necessary for survival, reflected the desperate state of the garrison as the siege ground on week after week. Yet despite these horrific conditions, Vienna's defense held through a combination of extraordinary leadership and civilian heroism that has rarely been matched in military history. Citizens, including women and children, worked tirelessly alongside soldiers to repair damage from constant bombardment, carry ammunition to the walls, and maintain the countermining operations that kept the city from falling. As August bled into September, Vienna was truly on its last legs. The garrison had been reduced to fewer than 5,000 able-bodied fighters, ammunition reserves were critically low, and food supplies had virtually disappeared. Their only hope lay with the promised relief army, but no one knew if help was actually coming. Communication with the outside world depended on incredibly brave individuals who risked torture and death to carry messages through Ottoman lines. The most famous of these heroes was Georg Franz Kolszycki, a Polish-Ukrainian merchant who spoke fluent Turkish and Arabic. Kolszycki disguised himself as an Ottoman soldier and slipped through enemy lines multiple times, carrying vital intelligence about the siege's progress and bringing back news that kept hope alive among the defenders. To signal their desperate situation to potential rescuers, Vienna's defenders fired rockets every night from the top of St. Stephen's Cathedral. These fiery signals, visible for kilometers, served as both a plea for help and a defiant message that the city still survived. Ottoman commanders repeatedly attempted to stop these signals by directing artillery fire at the cathedral, but the defenders always managed to repair the damage and continue their nightly display. By early September, Kara Mustafa knew that Vienna was at its breaking point. On the 4th of September, his miners finally detonated a massive mine beneath the Leopold bastion, blasting a wide gap in the city's defenses. Ferocious Ottoman assaults followed immediately, with Janissary units attempting to pour through the breach in overwhelming numbers. However, Starhemberg personally led the defense of this crucial breach, fighting alongside his men with sword and pistol to repel wave after wave of attackers. The fighting was so intense that bodies piled up in the breach itself, creating additional obstacles for subsequent attacks. Through sheer desperate courage, the Viennese managed to hold the gap and prevent the city's fall. By the second week of September, the Ottomans had secured footholds in several outer defenses and were preparing one final, massive mine to shatter Vienna's inner walls. For the exhausted, starving defenders, time had finally run out. Their salvation, if it came at all, would have to arrive within days. While Vienna endured its agony, an unlikely coalition was slowly assembling that would ultimately determine the fate of Europe. The central figure was the man upon whom Vienna's survival now completely depended: Jan III Sobieski, king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and one of the most brilliant military commanders of his generation. Born Jan Sobieski in 1629, he had spent virtually his entire adult life fighting the Ottoman Empire and understood their military methods better than any other European commander. He had won spectacular victories at Chosim in 1673 and numerous smaller engagements, earning him legendary status throughout Poland and recognition across Europe as Islam's most formidable Christian opponent. Sobieski was bound to march by the Treaty of Warsaw, but his motivation transcended mere treaty obligations. He viewed the Ottoman Siege of Vienna as a pivotal moment for all of Christendom, representing perhaps the last chance to strike a decisive blow against the empire that had terrorized Europe for centuries. Success would not only save Austria but secure his own legacy as the savior of Christian Europe. Assembling the relief army proved to be a logistical and diplomatic nightmare that tested every resource of the Habsburg monarchy. Leopold's diplomats, funded by subsidies from Pope Innocent XI, scrambled across the German states desperately begging for troops. The Pope had declared the Vienna campaign a crusade, offering plenary indulgences to all who participated, but German princes remained reluctant to commit substantial forces. Eventually, a coalition army of the Holy Roman Empire began to coalesce under Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, Leopold's brother-in-law and most capable general. This force included contingents from Bavaria under Elector Maximilian Emanuel, Saxony under Elector John George III, Franconia, Swabia, and various other German principalities. Each contingent brought its own commanders, supply systems, and tactical doctrines, creating enormous challenges for unified command. The Allied forces gathered at Tulln on the Danube, approximately 40 kilometers from Vienna, where on the 6th of September, Sobieski and his Polish army finally arrived after a grueling march across difficult terrain. The combined Christian army, which contemporary sources called the Holy League, numbered approximately 84,000 men, still outnumbered by the Ottomans, but representing a formidable force capable of challenging Ottoman supremacy. Command of this diverse coalition was given to Sobieski, both out of respect for his unparalleled experience fighting the Ottomans and recognition that Polish forces represented the coalition's most effective striking power. At a tense war council held on the 7th of September, German commanders argued for a conservative strategy focused on cutting Ottoman supply lines and avoiding decisive battle. Sobieski would have none of such cautious approaches. With Vienna's defenders firing their nightly distress signals and time running desperately short, he argued forcefully for direct, decisive action to crush the Ottoman army in a single devastating blow. His strategic vision and force of personality ultimately prevailed, setting the stage for one of history's most dramatic battles. The Allied advance toward Vienna required crossing the dense, hilly Vienna Woods, Wienerwald, a natural barrier that had protected the city from northern approaches for centuries. These forests, with their narrow paths and steep ravines, represented a significant tactical challenge for any large army attempting to deploy for battle. Here, Kara Mustafa made his second and most fatal error of the entire campaign. So consumed was he with the siege, so convinced that Vienna's fall was imminent, that he failed to properly secure the mountain passes through the Vienna Woods. He left the northern approaches to his camp dangerously exposed, keeping his elite Janissary units and best cavalry concentrated in the siege trenches for the final assault on Vienna's walls. This decision reflected both tactical incompetence and strategic overconfidence that would prove disastrous. A competent commander would have positioned significant forces to guard against exactly the kind of relief attempt that was now developing. Instead, Kara Mustafa had fatally underestimated both his opponent's capabilities and their determination. In a remarkable feat of military logistics that demonstrated the growing sophistication of European armies, the entire Holy League force crossed the Vienna Woods in just 4 days. The operation required careful coordination between multiple national contingents, precise timing to prevent units from becoming separated in the dense forests, and enormous physical endurance from soldiers carrying full equipment across difficult terrain. On the night of the 11th of September, 1683, the Allied army reached the heights of the Kahlenberg, a series of hills directly overlooking Vienna and the vast Ottoman camp spread below. For the first time in months, the defenders trapped within the city could see salvation approaching. The sight of Christian banners appearing on the northern heights sent waves of desperate joy throughout Vienna's surviving population. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 12th of September, 1683, as Kara Mustafa's forces began what they believed would be the final assault on Vienna's battered walls, the Allied forces deployed along the ridge in battle formation. As the sun rose, revealing the full extent of the Christian army to both defenders and besiegers, a signal cannon fired from the Kahlenberg. Mass was celebrated by military chaplains, and the battle for Vienna and the future of Europe began. The fighting commenced around dawn with Allied infantry advancing down the slopes toward Ottoman positions. What followed was a brutal, grinding battle that raged across the foothills for the entire day. Kara Mustafa found himself caught completely off guard, suddenly fighting a desperate war on 2 fronts, trying to complete the capture of Vienna while facing a massive enemy army attacking his rear. The Grand Vizier's response was fatally slow and indecisive. Despite the obviously critical situation, he remained reluctant to withdraw his elite Janissary units from the siege trenches, apparently believing he could still capture Vienna while simultaneously defeating the relief army. This division of forces weakened both efforts and ultimately doomed his entire campaign. Slowly but inexorably, the Allied infantry pushed the increasingly disorganized Ottoman forces back across the battlefield. By late afternoon, Ottoman defensive lines were stretched thin and demoralized, with many units beginning to waver under the relentless pressure. It was then that Sobieski, watching the battle's development from his command position on the high ground, recognized that the decisive moment had arrived. The Polish king arrayed his cavalry for the final crushing blow, a sight that has echoed through military history for over 3 centuries. 18,000 horsemen spread across the ridge, preparing for one of the largest cavalry charges of all time. At the very tip of this armored spear rode 3,000 of Poland's elite Winged Hussars, arguably the most fearsome heavy cavalry unit in the world. The Winged Hussars were famous throughout Europe for their distinctive armor and the massive feathered wings attached to their backs, which created both a terrifying visual silhouette and a thunderous sound as they charged. These wings, some reaching 2 meters in height, served psychological as much as practical purposes, creating an otherworldly appearance that often broke enemy morale before contact was even made. At approximately 5 p.m. on the 12th of September, 1683, Sobieski gave the order that would determine the fate of two empires. With a cry of Jesus Marija, W Spomagaj, Jesus and Mary, help us, he personally led the charge that would become legendary. What followed transcended mere military tactics to become something approaching divine intervention in the eyes of Christian Europe. The cavalry charge was described by eyewitnesses as resembling a natural disaster more than a military maneuver. The earth shook under thousands of hooves, the air filled with dust and the thunder of drums and trumpets, and the sight of the massive formation descending from the heights struck terror into Ottoman hearts, already shaken by a day of fierce fighting. The charge smashed into the Ottoman center with irresistible force, shattering formations that had seemed unbreakable just moments before. Weary Ottoman soldiers, already fighting for hours against determined infantry, had no answer to this avalanche of armored men and horses cascading down from the heights. Their carefully prepared defensive positions simply disintegrated under the impact. The Polish cavalry drove directly toward Kara Mustafa's elaborate command pavilion, a massive tent complex that housed the Grand Vizier's headquarters, treasury, and personal quarters. As Sobieski's horsemen approached, Kara Mustafa himself, seeing the wave of destruction rolling toward him, abandoned his command post and fled for his life, taking with him only the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad to prevent its capture by Christian hands. The collapse of the Ottoman army was total, chaotic, and irreversible. What had begun as an organized retreat quickly degenerated into panicked flight as news of the cavalry charge spread throughout Ottoman ranks. Soldiers abandoned their weapons, officers lost control of their units, and the entire massive force that had seemed invincible just hours earlier dissolved into a fleeing mob. In his rage and desperation, Kara Mustafa briefly ordered the massacre of Christian prisoners before he himself fled the battlefield. However, even this final act of spite was only partially carried out, as Ottoman units were too concerned with their own survival to spend time executing captives. The abandoned Ottoman camp represented one of the richest prizes in military history. The besieging army had brought with them not only military supplies, but the accumulated wealth of a massive campaign: gold and silver for paying troops, valuable fabrics and spices for trade, hundreds of fine horses, and countless other treasures gathered from across the Ottoman Empire. The victorious Allied soldiers and starving citizens of Vienna poured into this abandoned camp, which resembled a city unto itself. It took them a full week to inventory and collect all the spoils, which included enough supplies to feed Vienna for months. Among the most famous discoveries were sacks of coffee beans that, according to legend, introduced Vienna to the beverage that would become central to its culture. The meeting between Emperor Leopold and King Sobieski, when Leopold returned to his liberated capital, was famously awkward and revealed the complex politics underlying their alliance. Leopold's reception of his savior was notably cold and formal, reflecting both protocol concerns and perhaps jealousy over Sobieski's heroic role. This diplomatic slight would later contribute to growing tensions between Austria and Poland. For Kara Mustafa, the price of his catastrophic failure was absolute and swift. He managed to escape to Belgrade with a small retinue, but his enemies at the Ottoman court now had all the ammunition they needed to destroy him. His unauthorized expansion of the campaign's objectives, the enormous costs of the failed siege, and the devastating defeat had made him too dangerous to the Sultan's own position. On Christmas Day, 1683, by direct order of Sultan Mehmed IV, executioners arrived at Kara Mustafa's residence in Belgrade. Following Ottoman custom, the Grand Vizier was strangled with a silk cord, and his severed head was delivered to the Sultan on a silver platter. Even in death, Kara Mustafa's ambitions had sealed his destruction. The Battle of Vienna marked a profound and irreversible turning point in European history. It represented not just a single military victory, but the definitive end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. Never again would the Ottoman Empire pose such a direct existential threat to the Christian heartland of Europe. The psychological impact of the victory resonated throughout both Christian and Islamic worlds. For Christians, it seemed to prove divine favor for their cause and encouraged further resistance to Ottoman expansion. For Muslims, particularly within the Ottoman Empire itself, The defeat raised troubling questions about whether the empire had lost Allah's blessing. The victory emboldened the Habsburg monarchy to launch the Great Turkish War, 1683 to 1699, a sustained counteroffensive that would ultimately drive Ottoman forces out of almost all of Hungary and significantly shift the balance of power in southeastern Europe. Prince Eugene of Savoy would continue Sobieski's work with brilliant victories at Zenta, 1697, and other battles. The battle cemented the legend of Jan Sobieski and his Winged Hussars as the saviors of Christendom. Sobieski himself became known throughout Europe as the Lion of Lekistan and Defender of the Faith, titles that reflected his heroic status. The Polish king would spend his remaining years, he died in 1696, basking in this glory while struggling with the domestic challenges that his expensive foreign campaigns had created. The siege's aftermath produced cultural changes that extended far beyond military and political spheres. Popular myths, some historically accurate and others legendary, claim that both the croissant pastry shaped like the Islamic crescent to mock the defeated Ottomans and Vienna's famous coffee culture were born from this victory. While the croissant's origins are disputed by historians, it is historically verified that Viennese coffee culture did indeed begin with the hundreds of sacks of coffee beans abandoned by the fleeing Ottoman army. Georg Franz Kolschitsky, the brave spy who had carried messages through Ottoman lines, was reportedly granted the privilege of opening Vienna's first coffeehouse with beans recovered from the Ottoman camp. This establishment became the foundation of a coffee culture that would define Viennese social life for centuries to come. The city's legendary coffeehouse tradition, with its distinctive preparation methods and social rituals, can trace its origins directly to the 12th of September, 1683. The economic impact of the victory was equally significant. The enormous wealth captured from the Ottoman camp helped finance the Habsburg recovery and reconstruction efforts. More importantly, the lifting of the siege reopened crucial trade routes along the Danube, allowing commerce to resume between Central Europe and the Black Sea region. This economic revival contributed to the Austrian prosperity that would characterize the late 17th and early 18th centuries,